afternoon sun cast dappled shadows across the immaculate lawns of Ashworth Manor, where the annual Upper Netherby summer fete proceeded with the clockwork precision that only decades of tradition could achieve. Lady Constance Ashworth, resplendent in dove-grey silk and pearls that had belonged to her mother-in-law, surveyed the proceedings with the satisfaction of a general whose battle plans were unfolding exactly as intended. The vicar's wife manned the cake stall with appropriate deference, the local doctor engaged the magistrate in suitably weighty conversation, and the village children maintained a respectful distance from her prized rose garden. Miss Jane Marple occupied a comfortable wicker chair beneath the ancient oak that had witnessed a century of such gatherings. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically as she worked on what appeared to be a simple blue scarf, though her keen grey eyes missed nothing of the social choreography unfolding around her. She had accepted Lady Ashworth's invitation with the gentle enthusiasm she reserved for such occasions, knowing that village gatherings often revealed more about human nature than the most carefully constructed drawing-room drama. The manor itself stood as a testament to Victorian confidence, its red brick facade and tall windows speaking of an era when servants were numerous and social hierarchies carved in granite. Today, however, the reduced staff was evident to those who knew how to look. Only 3 servants remained in Lady Ashworth's employ: Mrs. Pemberton, the cook whose 30 years of service had earned her the privilege of speaking her mind; Tom Fletcher, the head gardener whose muscular frame and earnest manner had made him something of a favourite among the village ladies; and Rose Hargreaves, the parlour maid whose quiet efficiency had won her mistress's grudging approval over the past 18 months. Rose moved through the gathering with practised grace, her starched white apron pristine despite the afternoon's labours. She carried a silver tray laden with delicate spode teacups, navigating between clusters of guests with the invisible precision that marked a well-trained servant. Miss Marple noticed how the young woman's movements seemed less fluid than usual, how her eyes darted nervously towards certain faces in the crowd, a lingering glance at Dr. Pembroke as he adjusted his spectacles, a more troubled look at Geoffrey Ashworth, Lady Ashworth's nephew, who had arrived from London the previous week with the harried air of a man pursued by creditors. The conversation around Miss Marple centred on the comfortable concerns of village life, Mrs. Hartwell's prize-winning delphiniums, the new curate's rather progressive sermons, and the shocking rise in the price of everything since the war. But beneath these familiar topics, Miss Marple detected undercurrents of tension. Lady Ashworth's voice carried a sharper edge when addressing her nephew, and there was something strained in the way Dr. Pembroke avoided looking directly at Rose as she served his tea. Most intriguingly, Miss Marple observed that Rose's apron strings were tied in a hasty, uneven bow, quite unlike the precise double knot that Mrs. Pemberton insisted upon for all the household staff. As the afternoon progressed, the gathering settled into its comfortable rhythm. Ladies clustered around the refreshment tables, their voices rising and falling in the familiar cadence of genteel gossip. Gentlemen formed their own groups, discussing matters they deemed too weighty for feminine ears. Children darted between the adults like bright fish through coral, their laughter providing cheerful counterpoint to the more subdued adult conversations. It was nearly 4 o'clock when Rose approached Lady Ashworth with obvious reluctance. The parlour maid's usually composed expression showed signs of strain, and her hands trembled slightly as she leaned down to whisper something urgent in her mistress's ear. Lady Ashworth's face darkened immediately, her lips compressing into the thin line that household staff had learned to fear. "Absolutely not," Lady Ashworth's voice carried clearly across the lawn, causing several nearby conversations to pause. "We will discuss this matter later, in private. Return to your duties immediately." Rose's face flushed crimson, but she curtsied obediently and retreated toward the manor's service entrance. Miss Marple observed this exchange with particular interest, noting how several guests had turned to watch the brief drama. Geoffrey Ashworth, in particular, seemed unusually alert, his customary languid demeanour replaced by something more focused and predatory. 20 minutes later, Mrs. Pemberton emerged from the kitchen door, her usually ruddy complexion pale with shock. She approached Lady Ashworth with hurried steps, her cook's apron still dusted with flour from the afternoon's baking, her face bearing the expression of someone who had witnessed something beyond the normal scope of domestic crises. "Ma'am," Mrs. Pemberton's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the nearby guests, her words carried with devastating clarity. "It's Rose, ma'am. She's collapsed in the morning room. I fear she's gone." The silver teaspoon in Lady Ashworth's hand clattered against her saucer, the sound unnaturally loud in the stunned silence that followed. Dr. Pembroke was the first to react, setting down his cup and moving swiftly toward the manor with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to medical emergencies. Several other guests began to follow, but Lady Ashworth's voice stopped them with the authority of generations. "Please, everyone remain here," she commanded, though her usual imperious tone was noticeably shaken. "Dr. Pembroke will assess the situation." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and rose from her chair with the measured movements of someone who had witnessed enough of life's tragedies to know that haste rarely improved such situations. She followed at a discreet distance as doctor. Pembroke and Lady Ashworth entered the manor through the main entrance, Mrs. Pemberton trailing behind with obvious reluctance. The morning room was a study in interrupted domesticity. A tea service sat abandoned on the mahogany table, and the scent of roses from the garden mingled with something else, a faint, bitter odour that made Miss Marple's experienced nose wrinkle with recognition. Rose Hargreaves lay crumpled beside the tall windows that opened onto the terrace, her starched uniform now wrinkled, her face bearing the unmistakable pallor of death. But it was Rose's final position that caught Miss Marple's attention most keenly. The young woman's right hand was clenched tightly around something small and white, a piece of paper perhaps, or a handkerchief. Her left hand lay open beside a small silver bell that had apparently fallen from the side table, and most significantly, there was a loose section of skirting board nearby, as if someone had been attempting to hide something behind the wainscoting. Dr. Pembroke's examination was swift but thorough. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "I'm afraid there's no doubt. She's been dead for perhaps 20 minutes. The symptoms suggest poisoning, though we'll need a proper post-mortem examination to determine the exact cause." As the implications of this pronouncement settled over the room, Miss Marple found herself thinking, not of the obvious questions that would soon consume the investigation, but of smaller details that others might overlook. Rose's final whispered words to Lady Ashworth, the nervous energy that had marked her behaviour all afternoon, and most intriguingly, the way her apron strings had been tied, not with Mrs. Pemberton's regulation double knot, but hastily as if she had been in great distress or terrible hurry. The parlour maid's last confession, whatever its nature, had died with her. But Miss Marple suspected that the truth, like all secrets in small villages, would eventually find its way to the surface, no matter how deeply some might wish to bury it. A hush had settled over Ashworth Manor, the kind that follows calamity and clings to the edges of every word and gesture. Lady Ashworth, her face drawn and eyes fixed somewhere beyond the present, composed herself with an effort born of generations of discipline. Dr. Pembroke's calm authority had given way to a more guarded concern, as he quietly covered Rose's still form and advised Lady Ashworth to leave the scene undisturbed. Mrs. Pemberton, the cook, lingered in the doorway, shoulders shaking with restrained grief. Miss Marple stood discreetly by, her attention drifting across the room, noticing, as she often did, the things others missed. The silver bell, now resting on the carpet, the hastily tied apron strings, a single bow rather than Mrs. Pemberton's usual, double knot, the loosened skirting board, edges barely askew. There was also the faint, acrid scent in the room, out of place among the roses and polish, a whisper of something more sinister. At Lady Ashworth's request, Mrs. Pemberton hurried off to send Andrew for the village constable, and soon the guests who remained were ushered out onto the sunlit terrace. The garden, only moments before alive with the harmony of a village gathering, now bore the awkward silence of people trying not to stare at the house. The fête's gaiety had dissolved, replaced by the brittle murmur of speculation. "It's the heat, I imagine," Mrs. Hartwell announced to the vicar's wife, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "August always brings calamity. Fainting spells are just the beginning." The vicar's wife, ever practical, shook her head. Dr. Pembroke's face, well, I shouldn't repeat myself, but it didn't look like a simple fainting spell. She was such a quiet girl, too. Nearby, Mr. Ottershaw, the magistrate, suggested, "One can expect such things when discipline slips." Sir Lionel would never have allowed it. Constable Burton arrived on his battered bicycle, the cheery bell at odds with the grim mood. He listened gravely to Lady Ashworth's account, then entered the house with Dr. Pembroke. His presence sparked a fresh round of hushed speculation, rumour crackling through the crowd like static. "Poison," Mrs. Hartwell confided, savouring the drama. "Girls will do dreadful things for love, or if they've been wronged." Mrs. Price, who ran the post office and considered herself privy to all village secrets, countered. She wasn't the type. Sent off parcels yesterday, and there was a registered letter last week. London address, not her handwriting. Others remembered Tom Fletcher, the gardener, being near the morning room, and soon stories of his past were revived and embellished. "He's a strong one, that Tom," murmured Mrs. Lumley. "And there was that business years ago. A fight at the Crown, was it?" Tom himself stood apart, cap twisting in his hands. Miss Marple drifted toward him, her manner gentle. "It's difficult, Tom, when people talk," she said. He looked at her, confusion and worry mingling in his face. "I was in the potting shed, miss, near on 4. Young Eddie saw me. Then I fetched ice for Mrs. Pemberton. I passed by the side door, but I never went in, not till the constable came." "I see," said Miss Marple. "String is a useful thing. During the war we saved every bit. Oh, but no matter." She gave Tom a reassuring look before wandering away. Geoffrey Ashworth, cigarette trembling in his fingers, crossed her path. "Beastly business," he muttered. "My aunt can't manage this sort of thing." Lady Ashworth appeared, her voice regaining its familiar steel. "Geoffrey, find Mrs. Pemberton. She is not to speak to anyone but the constable." Or Dr. Pembroke Geoffrey nodded, but instead veered toward the library, closing the door behind him to make a hurried, half-audible phone call. "The remittance will be delayed. Personal matter. No, don't come down." Miss Marple, never one for eavesdropping, found she didn't need to. The urgency in his voice and the secrecy of his manner told her enough about the pressure he was under. Constable Burton reappeared to ask that no one leave until statements were taken. The guests complied, sorting themselves by perceived importance and proximity to scandal. Mrs. Pemberton soon emerged, red-eyed and defiant, fending off rumours about Tom. "He wouldn't harm a fly, let alone Rose. And I know where my staff are, always." Miss Marple quietly asked, "Did Rose always tie her apron in the same way, Mrs. Pemberton?" "Double knot," the cook replied, "just as I taught her. No bows, not with china about." Miss Marple nodded, a small, satisfied note in her expression. The vicar offered a prayer, soothing anxious minds, if not entirely dispelling the unease. As heads bowed, Mrs. Price let slip. "Saw Rose at the post office Tuesday. Sent a wire, London West." Seemed in a rush. "What did it say?" asked Mrs. Hartwell, eyes bright with curiosity. "Wouldn't know." But she asked if it would be there by noon. As the garden slowly emptied, the rumours took on new life in parlours and kitchens across Upper Netherby. Miss Marple's own cottage became a quiet hub for speculation. Villagers came under one pretence or another, each offering their version of events. Mrs. Hartwell described how Rose had seemed agitated, dropping a teacup, a rare lapse. Mr. Wiggins, the postman, mentioned a letter for Geoffrey Ashworth that left Rose pale and shaking. Mrs. Pemberton's niece insisted Geoffrey and Rose had argued near the kitchen garden. Theories multiplied. A jealous lover, a family secret, a servant's revenge. It was young Timothy Hartwell who provided a detail overlooked by his elders. She kept looking at a bit of paper in her pocket, he told Miss Marple, looked scared, kept reading it. Miss Marple's mind turned over these fragments, the apron strings, the bell, the skirting board, the letter. Rumour clung to Tom Fletcher and Geoffrey Ashworth, yet neither theory felt complete. She considered what was not being said. Rose's life before Ashworth, her family, her secrets. The invisible girl, now at the centre of everything. As the sun waned, Miss Marple sat with her knitting in her lap, reflecting on the web of half-truths and conjecture. She resolved to return to the manor, ostensibly to offer her condolences, but in truth to observe afresh. In her experience, the smallest details, the way a knot was tied, a letter folded, a bell misplaced, often revealed the deepest secrets. And in a village like Upper Netherby, secrets never stayed buried for long. Inspector Craddock arrived. With the morning mist, his motor car's steady hum cutting through the unnatural quiet that had settled over Ashworth Manor. Miss Marple, who had risen early for her customary constitutional, observed his approach from the lane with keen interest. He was a man of perhaps 45, with the methodical bearing of someone who had learned to distrust first impressions and easy answers. As he stepped from his vehicle, brushing imaginary dust from his coat, she noted the way his eyes took in the scene, not with the dramatic flair of a detective from popular fiction, but with the patient thoroughness of a craftsman beginning a complex task. Lady Ashworth received him in the drawing-room, having deemed the morning-room still too distressing for formal interviews. Miss Marple, arriving shortly afterward, under the thoughtful pretext of offering assistance with correspondence during this difficult time, found herself positioned near the tall windows with an excellent view of the proceedings. Her knitting provided the perfect camouflage for observation, the rhythmic click of her needles a soothing counterpoint to the inspector's measured questions. "The deceased had been in your employ for how long, Lady Ashworth?" Inspector Craddock's notebook remained poised, his pen capturing each detail with bureaucratic precision. 18 months, came the reply, though Miss Marple noticed how Lady Ashworth's fingers worried at the pearl brooch on her lapel, a gesture entirely foreign to her usual composed demeanour. More intriguingly, the brooch itself seemed hastily positioned, slightly askew in a way that spoke of distracted dressing. Inspector Craddock methodically examined the morning-room, his attention naturally drawn to the obvious elements: the position where Rose had fallen, the abandoned tea service, the small silver bell that had somehow found its way from the library. What he did not appear to notice was the section of skirting board that Miss Marple had observed the previous day, wood that sat just slightly proud of its neighbours, as if recently disturbed. The household staff were summoned one by one. Mrs. Pemberton appeared with the promptness that spoke of 3 decades' faithful service, her eyes still bearing traces of genuine grief, but her manner professionally composed. "Tell me about Miss Hargreaves' behaviour yesterday morning. Was anything unusual in her routine?" Mrs. Pemberton's hands twisted in her apron. "She seemed nervous-like, sir." Dropped a teacup at breakfast. First time I'd seen such clumsiness from Rose, and she kept asking about the post, whether anything had come for her or for Master Geoffrey. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. The mention of post was particularly intriguing, especially considering young Timothy's observation about Rose repeatedly reading something from her pocket. Tom Fletcher entered next, his large frame seeming to dwarf the refined furnishings. His hands, despite obvious attempts at cleaning, still bore the honest stains of his trade. He stood awkwardly, cap twisted between his fingers, the very picture of a man uncomfortable in surroundings not his own. "I was in the potting shed most of the afternoon, sir," he said when questioned about his whereabouts. "Young Eddie from the village can vouch for that. Helped me with the dahlia stakes till near 4 o'clock. Then Mrs. Pemberton asked me to fetch ice from the cold store." "You passed by the morning-room?" "Aye, sir. The side door was standing open for the air, but I never went inside. Rose was always particular about her duties. Wouldn't have welcomed interruption." Miss Marple observed how Tom's eyes carefully avoided the spot where Rose had fallen, his obvious distress suggesting genuine grief rather than guilt. More significantly, his mention of the open door provided crucial information about accessibility to the room. Geoffrey Ashworth appeared for his interview with visible reluctance, his usual languid manner seeming forced, as if he were playing a familiar role that no longer fit comfortably. His hands trembled slightly as he lit his cigarette, and Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis he placed on certain words when describing his afternoon activities. "I was attending to correspondence in the library," he told Inspector Craddock. "Business matters that required immediate attention. I made several telephone calls, the operator might remember. I believe I glimpsed Rose passing by the window around 3:30. Miss Marple's mental catalogue expanded. Geoffrey claimed to have seen Rose at 3:30, yet Mrs. Pemberton had placed the girl in the kitchen helping with lunch preparations at that time. Such discrepancies, in her experience, rarely proved accidental. While Inspector Craddock conducted his systematic examination of Rose's modest quarters in the servants' hall, Miss Marple found herself drawn to observe the more subtle changes in the Manor's daily rhythms. In the main hall, the morning's post lay arranged on the side table with studied precision, too neat, as if arranged by anxious hands aware of being observed. She had passed that table twice the previous day, Something had definitely shifted. The letter at the top, addressed to Harcourt and Blythe solicitors, bore a faint pencil marking, the letter G partially erased, and sat among the incoming correspondence rather than in the silver tray typically used for outgoing post. That tray, Miss Marple recalled, ordinarily resided on the library escritoire, yet now it stood closer to the fireplace, its usual position marked by a telling shadow of dust on the desktop. More intriguingly, the writing blotter bore paper that seemed too clean, too fresh, as if recently replaced. At its corner, a tiny shaving of red sealing wax clung like a bright beetle. Curious, since Lady Ashworth invariably used gummed envelopes and navy ink for her correspondence. As inspector, Craddock concluded his preliminary interviews. Miss Marple excused herself to consult with Mrs. Pemberton about funeral arrangements. In the kitchen, she casually inquired about the morning's postal delivery. Such a lot of correspondence Lady Ashworth must receive, she mused gently. Mrs. Pemberton sighed deeply. Indeed, Miss Marple. And this morning brought something unusual, a letter for Master Geoffrey, delivered by hand rather than by post. From London it was, and he looked quite disturbed by it. This detail settled alongside the others in Miss Marple's orderly mind. Rose's nervousness about the post, Geoffrey's claimed telephone calls, and now a hand-delivered letter that had clearly caused him distress. When Inspector Craddock prepared to depart, having found no immediate smoking gun or clear motive beyond the usual household tensions, Miss Marple approached him with her characteristic gentle manner. "Such a tragic business, Inspector," she said softly. "That poor girl always seemed so meticulous about her duties. I couldn't help noticing yesterday that her apron was tied with a simple bow, rather than Mrs. Pemberton's regulation double knot. So unlike her usual precision." Craddock paused, giving her a polite but somewhat dismissive look. "A minor detail, Miss Marple, hardly relevant to a case of poisoning." "Perhaps," she replied, her grey eyes steady. "But sometimes, Inspector, it's the smallest details that speak most clearly. Like letters that find themselves in unexpected places, or silver bells that wander from their proper rooms." The inspector merely nodded, clearly focused on more substantial evidence. Miss Marple understood his perspective. He was searching for tangible proof, clear motives, obvious connections. But she had learned through long experience that human nature rarely revealed itself through grand gestures. The truth more often lay hidden in the subtle disruptions of daily routine, in the small betrayals of habit that marked a mind under extraordinary pressure. As his motor car disappeared down the drive, Miss Marple remained in the Manor's entrance hall, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The investigation was proceeding along predictable lines, but she sensed that the real story lay deeper than Inspector Craddock's methodical approach would initially uncover. Rose Hargreaves had died with a secret clutched in her hand, and that secret was beginning to cast long shadows through the ordered life of Ashworth Manor. The parlour maid's confession, whatever its true nature, was far from finished revealing itself. Inspector Craddock returned the following morning with the focused determination of a man who had spent the night sifting through statements and cross-referencing alibis. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself in the drawing-room with her knitting and a strategic view of the entrance hall, observed his purposeful stride and recognized the dangerous confidence of an investigator convinced he had found his quarry. The manor itself seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. Doors closed more quietly, conversations dropped to whispers, and even the servants moved with the careful precision of people aware they were being watched. Lady Ashworth received the inspector with visible apprehension, her usual commanding presence diminished by the weight of suspicion now hanging over her household. Inspector Craddock wasted no time on pleasantries, consulting his notebook with theatrical precision. "I've made inquiries into your staff's backgrounds, Lady Ashworth. Tom Fletcher's history proves rather more colourful than he initially indicated." The inspector's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who believed he had uncovered crucial evidence. 7 years ago, Fletcher was involved in a serious altercation at the Crown in Little Wickham. A young woman was injured badly enough to require medical attention. The charges were dropped, but the circumstances were troubling. Lady Ashworth's teacup rattled against its saucer. "I was aware of some difficulty in his past, Inspector, but Tom has been exemplary in his service here. He's gentle with the gardens, reliable. Nevertheless, Craddock interrupted, yesterday's events take on a different complexion when viewed against this background. We've also discovered that Miss Hargreaves had recently rebuffed Fletcher's romantic advances. Mrs. Higgins, your daily charwoman, overheard a heated exchange between them near the kitchen garden last week. She described Rose as telling Fletcher he was reaching above his station. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. The image of Tom's genuine distress the previous day seemed inconsistent with a man harbouring murderous resentment. Yet she understood the appeal of such a straightforward motive for the police. When Tom was summoned for questioning, his transformation from the previous day was heartbreaking. Gone was his quiet dignity, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of a man watching his carefully rebuilt life crumble. His large hands twisted his cap as Inspector Craddock pressed him about the missing tin of fumigant from his potting shed. "The lock was engaged when I left for the fete," Tom insisted, his voice thick with emotion. "Someone else must have taken the key. Mrs. Pemberton keeps a spare for emergencies." "Convenient," Craddock observed coldly. "And this missing fumigant would contain digitalis compounds, would it not?" "Quite sufficient to cause the symptoms, Doctor," Pembroke observed. Tom's face crumpled. "I never harmed Rose, sir. She was a good girl, always polite. Why would I want to hurt her?" But even as Tom protested his innocence, Miss Marple noted how his story seemed to shift under pressure. His timeline became less certain, his explanations more convoluted, painting an increasingly damaging picture of a man with secrets to hide. The inspector's attention then turned to Geoffrey Ashworth, who had appeared in the doorway with the studied nonchalance of a man trying to appear unconcerned. His entrance provided a welcome distraction from Tom's obvious distress, though Miss Marple observed how Geoffrey's eyes immediately sought out the inspector's notebook as if assessing what had been recorded. "Mr. Ashworth," Inspector Craddock began without preamble, "I understand you've been experiencing considerable financial difficulties. My inquiries reveal that your aunt recently advanced you nearly £3,000 against your future inheritance." The brandy glass in Geoffrey's hand trembled slightly. Lady Ashworth's sharp intake of breath confirmed the accuracy of the inspector's information before Geoffrey could respond. "Nothing unusual for a man of my circumstances," Geoffrey replied, but his voice carried a defensive edge that fooled no one. "Temporary setbacks, nothing more. Temporary setbacks that might become permanent if certain irregularities came to light," Craddock pressed. "Perhaps Miss Hargreaves discovered information that threatened your financial arrangements with your aunt. The hand-delivered letter you received yesterday morning, for instance. From creditors, perhaps." Geoffrey's practised composure finally cracked. "What are you implying, Inspector? That I would murder a servant girl over money?" Miss Marple found herself observing a fascinating interplay of guilt and innocence. Both men displayed the unmistakable signs of people harbouring secrets, yet neither seemed to fit the role of murderer in quite the way Inspector Craddock imagined. Tom's past certainly cast shadows over his character, but his genuine grief for Rose seemed inconsistent with having caused her death. Geoffrey was clearly desperate for money, and had been deceptive about his circumstances, but his reaction suggested surprise rather than the careful preparation of a calculated killer. As the morning progressed, the village gossip mill churned with renewed energy. Mrs. Higgins, suddenly elevated to the status of key witness, held court at the baker's shop, describing in increasingly dramatic detail the argument she had overheard between Tom and Rose. The general consensus settled comfortably on Tom as the obvious culprit, a man with a violent past, rejected by the victim, with access to both the house and the means of murder. Yet Miss Marple remained troubled by details that didn't align with either theory. During a quiet moment with Mrs. Pemberton, she learned that Rose had maintained a strict routine, polishing the brass in the morning room every Tuesday after the post arrived, her quiet time when she was least likely to be disturbed. This detail resonated with the disturbed skirting board and the misplaced correspondence Miss Marple had observed. When Inspector Craddock announced his intention to make an arrest by evening, Miss Marple felt compelled to speak. "Inspector," she said gently, "might I suggest that the truth may prove more complex than it initially appears? In my experience, when two obvious suspects present themselves so clearly, it's often worth examining what lies beneath the obvious." Craddock's smile was politely dismissive. With respect, Miss Marple, police work requires evidence, not intuition. We have means, motive, and opportunity for both Fletcher and Ashworth. One of them killed Rose Hargreaves. As the inspector departed to finalise his case, Miss Marple remained in the morning room, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The investigation was moving toward its conclusion with the inexorable momentum of official certainty, yet she sensed that the real truth remained hidden. The hastily tied apron strings, the misplaced silver bell, the Tuesday routine, all suggested a story far more complex than a gardener's rage or a nephew's desperation. The parlour maid's confession was still waiting to be properly understood, and until it was, justice would remain as elusive as morning mist. The afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the morning room as Miss Marple found herself quite alone with her thoughts and the lingering mysteries that Inspector Craddock's confident departure had left unresolved. Lady Ashworth had retreated to her private sitting-room with what she termed a severe headache, though Miss Marple suspected it was more the weight of implications than any physical ailment that troubled her. The house had settled into that peculiar quiet that follows official pronouncements, not peaceful but watchful, as if the very walls were holding secrets close. Miss Marple moved with deliberate care around the room, her experienced eye cataloguing the subtle details that spoke more eloquently than any witness statement. The silver bell remained where it had fallen, photographed and measured by the police but not truly understood. She knelt beside it with some difficulty, her knitting bag providing a convenient excuse for the movement, and examined both the bell and the carpet beneath, with the thoroughness of someone who had learned to read stories in the smallest disruptions of daily order. The bell bore a tiny engraved L on its base, library then, yet here it lay in the morning room, far from its proper place. More intriguingly, the carpet showed not the random impression of something dropped, but the deliberate mark of something placed with purpose. The bell had been used as a tool, she realised, noting the slight scuff on one side that suggested it had been employed as a wedge or lever. Rising carefully, Miss Marple turned her attention to the section of skirting board that had troubled her since Rose's death. The wood was painted in the same cream shade as the rest of the room, but one section showed the telltale signs of recent disturbance. Paint slightly chipped along the lower edge, wood sitting just fractionally proud of its neighbours. When she pressed gently with her knitting needle, the board shifted with the faintest complaint. Behind the loosened section lay a small cavity, clearly created with both patience and determination. Within it, wrapped in brown paper and tied with ordinary string, was a packet no larger than a prayer book. Miss Marple extracted it with trembling fingers, her pulse quickening, not with excitement, but with the quiet satisfaction of a theory confirmed. The contents told a story far more complex than Inspector Craddock's straightforward theories of jealous gardeners or desperate nephews. There were 3 items: a small notebook in Rose's careful handwriting, 2 post office receipts for money orders sent to London, and a torn corner of an envelope bearing the embossed crest of Harcourt and Blythe, solicitors. The notebook contained entries dated over the past month, written in the practical style of someone who distrusted her own memory under pressure. Tuesday last saw Mr. G take letter from hall table, red wax seal, return different envelope later, no seal. Mrs. P at stove entire time. Another entry read, heard voices in library, Lady A very angry. Not again, Geoffrey. Door closed quickly when footsteps approached. The post office receipts showed money orders of £10 each, sent to 1 M. Jessup at an address in Bayswater, substantial sums for a parlour maid's wages. Most telling was a final entry, clearly written in great distress. Letter received. Threat to tell Lady A about the watching unless money continues. Cannot afford more. Must speak to someone. Miss Marple studied the torn envelope corner with particular interest. The crest matched correspondence she had observed on the hall table, yet this fragment bore traces of red sealing wax, quite unlike Lady Ashworth's customary gummed envelopes and navy ink. Someone in the household had been conducting correspondence with the family solicitors in a manner designed to appear official while concealing their identity. The implications were becoming clearer. Rose had not been a blackmailer herself, but rather an unwilling observer who had stumbled upon someone else's deception. Her careful documentation suggested a girl trying to protect herself, or perhaps Gathering evidence to expose wrongdoing, she felt powerless to stop directly. The money orders indicated she was being coerced into silence, paying someone to keep quiet about what she had witnessed. Miss Marple carefully rewrapped the evidence and replaced it in its hiding place. This was not yet the moment for official revelations. Too many questions remained unanswered. But one crucial piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. She made her way to the kitchen, where she found Mrs. Pemberton rolling pastry, with the determined vigour of someone channeling anxiety into useful work. "Such beautiful silver in this house," Miss Marple remarked conversationally. "I noticed the handbells are kept in perfect condition. At the Bantries, they polish them every Friday." "Tuesdays here," Mrs. Pemberton replied without looking up from her work. "Rose always did the bells on Tuesday afternoons, after the post came and things quieted down. 3 o'clock sharp, she'd collect them from the rooms, back by 4:30. Very particular about it, she was. So, if someone claimed to have rung for service in the morning room yesterday at, say, 4:20, Mrs. Pemberton's rolling pin paused. They'd be telling tales. The morning room bell was right here in the scullery, being polished proper. Library bell, too. I saw them both on the board myself. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The bell had been moved deliberately, used as a tool to access Rose's hidden cache. But by whom, and when? The answer lay somewhere in the careful timing of Tuesday routines and the dangerous knowledge that Rose had been forced to carry. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Pemberton added quietly, "Rose was a good girl, Miss Marple. Whatever folks might say about her being secretive, she was just trying to do right by everyone. Sometimes that's harder than it ought to be." Walking slowly back through the Manor's corridors, Miss Marple reflected on the tragedy of Rose Hargreaves, a young woman caught between loyalty and conscience, trying to navigate waters far deeper and more dangerous than her position should have required. The parlour maid's confession was beginning to reveal its true nature. Not an admission of guilt, but a desperate attempt to escape from a web of deception that someone else had spun, using Rose's honest nature and precarious position against her. The bell had wandered from library to morning room for a purpose. The skirting board had been disturbed by someone who knew of Rose's hiding place, and somewhere in the careful documentation of household secrets lay the key to understanding why a young woman had died for trying to tell the truth. Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting, certain now that the real murderer was someone who understood the rhythms of domestic life well enough to manipulate them, and desperate enough to kill to keep their own secrets buried. The evening shadows lengthened across Ashworth Manor as Miss Marple settled into the uncomfortable task of unravelling secrets that had been carefully buried for decades. The hidden packet behind the skirting board had provided crucial evidence, but it had also raised questions that demanded delicate handling. Rose's notebook entries about red wax seals and switched correspondence painted a picture of deception that went far deeper than simple financial desperation or romantic jealousy. Her first priority was to understand the family connections that Rose's payments to M. Jessup in Bayswater suggested. Miss Marple found Mrs. Pemberton in the kitchen, methodically cleaning the copper pots with the vigorous attention that grief often channeled into familiar tasks. The cook's red-rimmed eyes and trembling hands spoke of genuine sorrow, but there was something else, a burden of knowledge that seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. "Such a loss for you personally, Mrs. Pemberton," Miss Marple said gently, settling into the wooden chair beside the great oak table. "One can see that Rose meant more to you than simply another housemaid." Mrs. Pemberton's hand stilled on the copper pot. For a long moment, the only sound was the steady tick of the kitchen clock. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "She was my sister's girl, Miss Marple. Martha Jessup is my maiden name. My younger sister lives in Bayswater now, poorly these last years with her chest. Rose sent her what she could from her wages, 10 shillings when times were good, more when she could manage it." The cook's voice broke slightly. "I told no one in this house. A woman in service must be careful about family connections. Rose wanted to earn her place on merit, not favouritism." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. The money orders in Rose's cash now made perfect sense. Not blackmail payments, but a frightened girl trying to protect her family while being coerced into silence about something she had witnessed. Did Rose confide in you about what was troubling her these past weeks?" "She said someone was meddling with the post, switching letters. She'd seen it happen more than once during her Tuesday bell polishing. I told her to keep her head down, that it wasn't our business to question our betters." Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried the weight of terrible regret. "If I'd listened properly, if I'd encouraged her to speak up." The revelation of Rose's family connection cast new light on the girl's careful documentation. She hadn't been gathering evidence for personal gain, but trying to protect herself and her aunt from someone who had discovered their relationship and was using it as leverage for silence. Miss Marple's next visit was to Dr. Pembroke's surgery, where she found him reviewing patient files with the distracted air of a man whose mind was elsewhere. His usually steady hands showed a slight tremor as he set down his pen, and his professional composure seemed more fragile than usual. "Such a shocking business about poor Rose," Miss Marple began, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "I couldn't help noticing that she seemed particularly nervous in your presence lately, almost as if she were afraid of something." Dr. Pembroke's face tightened. "I barely knew the girl, Miss Marple." "Our interactions were purely professional when I attended Lady Ashworth." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I understand you keep certain medications at the Manor for Lady Ashworth's convenience." "Digitalis drops for her heart palpitations, I believe, stored in the little pantry off the library." The effect was immediate and telling. Dr. Pembroke's face went pale and his hands gripped the edge of his desk. "How could you possibly know about that arrangement?" "Ladies with long-standing anxieties often develop private medical arrangements," Miss Marple replied gently. "I imagine a small bottle has gone missing recently." After a long pause, Doctor Pembroke nodded reluctantly. "I discovered it yesterday when I checked the cabinet. Lady Ashworth has suffered from nervous episodes since Sir Lionel's death. The arrangement was discreet, for her privacy." Miss Marple understood. The missing digitalis provided both means and access. Someone familiar with the house's medical arrangements had used Lady Ashworth's own medicine to silence Rose permanently. Her final conversation of the evening was with Lady Ashworth herself, whom she found in the drawing-room staring at a family portrait with obvious distress. The painting showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Lady Ashworth in her youth, though the period costume suggested an earlier era. "Family resemblances can be quite remarkable," Miss Marple observed, following Lady Ashworth's gaze to the portrait. "That was Sir Lionel's ward, Evelyn," Lady Ashworth said carefully. "She died very young before our marriage." Miss Marple's experienced eye caught the slight hesitation, the careful choice of words. Rose mentioned finding some old papers in the library that confused her about family relationships, birth certificates and such. She was such an honest girl. When something puzzled her, she felt compelled to seek the truth. Lady Ashworth's composure finally cracked. "She found the original documents. Evelyn wasn't Lionel's ward. She was my daughter, born when I was 17 and unmarried. Lionel and his first wife raised her as their own. When they both died, I married Lionel to protect the secret, to ensure Evelyn's legitimacy and inheritance rights." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Miss Marple understood now why Rose's discovery had been so dangerous. In an era when illegitimate birth carried devastating social consequences, such a secret was worth killing to protect, or to exploit. "And someone else learned of this secret," Miss Marple said quietly. "Someone who saw opportunity where Rose saw only confusion. Someone who knew about your correspondence with Harcourt and Blythe regarding inheritance matters, who could forge letters with red sealing wax to create the appearance of official communication." Lady Ashworth nodded miserably. "The codicil I intended for the staff. It would have provided for Rose's future, for Mrs. Pemberton's retirement. But someone intercepted the correspondence, used the information to pressure Rose into silence about what she had witnessed. When she finally tried to tell me the truth at the fete—" Miss Marple completed the thought silently. Rose's final attempt to confess what she knew had sealed her fate. Someone in the house had recognized that the parlour maid's honesty made her too dangerous to live, and had used Lady Ashworth's own medicine to ensure her permanent silence. The web of secrets was finally beginning to unravel, but Miss Marple knew that the most dangerous moment was yet to come. The real murderer was still among them, watching and waiting, perhaps already planning their next move to protect the carefully constructed deception that had cost Rose Hargreaves her life. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ashworth Manor's facade when the acrid smell of smoke began to drift through the corridors, carrying with it the sharp scent of burning paper and something more deliberate, the unmistakable odour of paraffin. Miss Marple, who had risen early to tend her thoughts in the garden, noticed the wisps of grey curling from the Manor's east wing just as Mrs. Pemberton's voice shattered the morning quiet with a cry of alarm that brought the entire household running. The estate office, that small but crucial repository of the Ashworth family's most sensitive documents, was ablaze. Flames licked hungrily at the tall windows while smoke billowed from beneath the heavy oak door that Sir Lionel had installed decades earlier to protect his private papers. The fire had clearly been burning for some time, though its discovery seemed almost providential, or perhaps deliberately timed for maximum effect with minimum risk to the Manor's occupants. Geoffrey Ashworth appeared in the corridor with remarkable speed, already fully dressed despite the early hour, his movements suggesting someone who had been anticipating rather than surprised by the emergency. He threw himself into the firefighting efforts with an energy that seemed almost theatrical, shouting orders and organising bucket brigades with the authority of someone determined to be seen taking charge. Yet Miss Marple noticed how his eyes kept darting toward the flames with an expression that seemed more calculating than concerned. Lady Ashworth stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale as she watched decades of family records disappear into smoke and ash. Her distress seemed genuine enough, though Miss Marple observed how her gaze lingered not on the general destruction but on specific areas of the room, the mahogany desk where correspondence was kept, the filing cabinets that housed legal documents, and most tellingly, the small iron safe that stood untouched in the corner, its door hanging open like an accusation. Inspector Craddock arrived with the local fire brigade, his expression grim as he surveyed the damage. The fire had been contained to the single room, but that room happened to house the very documents that might have shed light on Rose's mysterious knowledge, and the correspondence she had observed being tampered with during her Tuesday afternoon duties. "Arson?" the inspector pronounced after a brief examination, pointing to the telltale signs of accelerant use and the deliberately targeted nature of the destruction. Someone wanted to ensure that certain papers could never be examined. The investigation of the fire scene revealed details that spoke eloquently of both planning and desperation. A small tin that had contained paraffin was discovered by the side door, hastily discarded, but bearing fingerprints that would need careful analysis. More intriguingly, Miss Marple observed traces of red sealing wax melted into the floorboards near the desk, far more than would be expected from ordinary correspondence, suggesting an extensive operation involving forged documents and false official seals. The pattern of destruction told its own story. The flames had been concentrated around the desk and filing cabinets, where Lady Ashworth kept her correspondence with Harcourt and Blythe, the family solicitors. The safe, though opened, remained largely undamaged, its contents apparently removed before the fire began. This selective destruction suggested someone with intimate knowledge of where specific documents were kept and what needed to be eliminated. Geoffrey's behaviour during the aftermath proved particularly revealing. While maintaining his pose of helpful concern, he seemed remarkably well informed about which documents had been destroyed and which had been spared. When Inspector Craddock questioned him about the estate's legal arrangements, Geoffrey's responses carried a confidence that hadn't been present in earlier interviews, as if the fire had somehow strengthened his position rather than merely creating chaos. "Fortunately," Geoffrey mentioned with studied casualness, "I maintain copies of the most important documents in my London chambers. The inheritance arrangements need not be disrupted by this unfortunate incident." Miss Marple found this revelation particularly significant. If Geoffrey possessed duplicate documents, he would have known precisely which originals needed to be destroyed to eliminate evidence of tampering. The fire began to look less like a desperate act of destruction and more like a calculated move to remove specific threats while maintaining plausible deniability. Dr. Pembroke's reaction provided another piece of the puzzle. His medical training had made him efficient in organising the emergency response, yet Miss Marple noticed how he avoided looking directly at the damaged desk area and seemed unusually eager to leave once the immediate danger had passed. His earlier admission about the missing digitalis drops suddenly took on new significance in light of his obvious discomfort with the fire's aftermath. As the household began the grim task of assessing what had been lost, Miss Marple made her own careful examination of the scene. Among the charred remains, she discovered not only the telltale traces of red sealing wax, but also evidence of a more extensive forgery operation than anyone had suspected. Fragments of official letterhead, partially melted seals, and the ghostly impressions of erased text on surviving paper scraps painted a picture of systematic deception that went far beyond simple correspondence tampering. The fire had been intended to eliminate evidence, but it had also revealed the scope of the deception Rose had stumbled upon. Someone had been conducting an elaborate fraud using forged documents bearing official seals, manipulating legal correspondence to serve their own purposes. Rose's careful observations about switched letters were merely the visible surface of a much deeper conspiracy. Most tellingly, the arsonist had made crucial errors born of desperation. The selective nature of the destruction, the hasty disposal of the paraffin tin, and the traces of sealing wax all pointed to someone who understood the manor's routines intimately, but was now operating under extreme pressure. The careful planning that had characterized Rose's murder was giving way to increasingly reckless actions. Miss Marple settled into her chair in the drawing-room as the smoke finally cleared, her knitting needles clicking with the steady rhythm of organized thought. The second incident had not achieved its intended purpose of eliminating evidence. Instead, it had created new clues while revealing the killer's growing desperation. The person who had murdered Rose to protect their secrets was now trapped by their own deception, forced into increasingly bold actions that would ultimately expose them. The parlour maid's confession was about to claim another victim, this time the person who had killed to silence it. The acrid smell of smoke still clung to the morning air when Miss Marple arranged her carefully orchestrated tea gathering for that same afternoon. The drawing-room at Ashworth Manor had been prepared with the precision of a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate, chairs arranged to encourage both conversation and observation, the silver tea service placed where nervous hands might betray themselves, and Miss Marple herself positioned with an unobstructed view of every face around the table. Lady Ashworth presided over the tea service with her customary grace, though the strain of recent events showed in the slight tremor of her hands and the careful way she avoided looking directly at anyone for too long. Geoffrey arrived with renewed confidence, his manner suggesting a man who believed the morning's fire had solved his problems rather than created new ones. Dr. Pembroke appeared reluctantly, his medical bag clutched like a talisman, while Mrs. Pemberton completed the gathering with the resigned dignity of someone who understood that secrets could no longer be contained. Miss Marple began with the gentle reminiscences that had served her so well over the years, her knitting needles maintaining their steady rhythm as she spoke. "Such disturbing events we've witnessed," she said, pouring tea with methodical precision. "It brings to mind a rather curious incident that occurred in St. Mary Mead some years ago. A young gentleman of good family found himself in rather desperate financial circumstances. Geoffrey's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer, but he recovered quickly, reaching for his cigarette case with studied nonchalance. Miss Marple continued as if she had noticed nothing unusual. "This young man was terribly clever, you understand, and far too proud to admit his difficulties openly. He devised what he believed to be a perfect solution, forging his elderly aunt's correspondence with her solicitors, using official seals and letterhead to create documents that would release funds early from his inheritance. The effect was immediate and telling. Dr. Pembroke's knuckles whitened as he gripped his chair arms, while Geoffrey's match scraped twice before catching, his hands betraying the tension his face tried to conceal. The fascinating aspect," Miss Marple continued, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone recounting established fact, "was how meticulous he was. Red sealing wax, proper letterhead, even the correct forms of address. He knew his aunt's habits intimately, when she received post, when she was likely to be distracted, when servants would be occupied with their duties." Lady Ashworth leaned forward slightly, her voice carefully controlled. "What exposed this deception?" Miss Marple smiled sadly. "A housemaid, I'm afraid. A conscientious girl who took particular pride in her Tuesday afternoon duties, polishing the silver bells, arranging the post, tidying the morning room when the house was quiet. She began to notice small discrepancies, letters that seemed different upon closer examination, the faint scent of paraffin from where sealing wax had been melted over candles, tiny inconsistencies that spoke to her honest nature. She reached into her knitting bag and withdrew the small silver bell, placing it gently on the table where it caught the afternoon light. The engraved L on its base seemed to gleam with accusatory brightness. This poor girl kept careful notes of what she observed, hidden away where she thought they would be safe. She even tried, in her innocent way, to warn her mistress about the irregularities she had witnessed. But the forger discovered her documentation, realized the threat she represented to his carefully constructed deception. Geoffrey's cigarette burned down unattended, ash lengthening dangerously as his attention became completely absorbed by Miss Marple's quiet recitation. When the ash finally fell onto the polished table, he dabbed at it with his handkerchief too quickly, too frantically. The tragedy, Miss Marple continued, her needles pausing for emphasis, was that the young man panicked. He used something readily available, his aunt's own heart medication, to silence the girl permanently. Digitalis, can be quite effective when properly administered. The girl's collapse appeared natural, even merciful. Dr. Pembroke made a small, strangled sound, his face going ashen as the implication settled over him. But it was Geoffrey who provided the most revealing reaction. His hand jerked, so violently that his teacup overturned completely, sending Darjeeling spreading across the white tablecloth like an accusation. "Of course," Miss Marple said, calmly mopping up the spill with her napkin. When the authorities began to investigate, and the forger realized his meticulous documentation might be discovered, he resorted to more desperate measures. A fire, carefully set to destroy specific evidence while maintaining plausible deniability about the cause. Geoffrey pushed back from the table so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "This is outrageous," he stammered, his careful composure finally cracking. "You're suggesting you can't possibly think—" Miss Marple's grey eyes met his steadily, her voice remaining gentle but carrying the inexorable weight of absolute certainty. "I'm suggesting, Mr. Ashworth, that someone in this room knew Rose's Tuesday routine well enough to time her murder precisely. Someone who understood which documents needed to be destroyed and where Lady Ashworth's digitalis was kept. Someone who could forge official correspondence convincingly enough to deceive even experienced solicitors." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Mrs. Pemberton's quiet weeping and the steady tick of the mantel clock. Geoffrey stood frozen, trapped between denial and confession, his face cycling through expressions of rage, fear, and desperate calculation. Miss Marple lifted the silver bell, letting it chime once softly. The bell told its own story, you see. Moved from the library to the morning room, used as a lever to access Rose's hiding place behind the skirting board. Only someone who knew about her Tuesday polishing schedule would be confident that no one would ring for service at that precise moment. The psychological trap had been perfectly laid, and Geoffrey Ashworth had walked into it with the inevitability of Greek tragedy. His careful facade crumbled completely, leaving only the desperate man beneath, finally exposed by his own reactions to Miss Marple's gentle but relentless reconstruction of his crimes. The parlour maid's confession was about to be heard at last, not from Rose's lips, but through the unravelling of the man who had killed to silence it. The overturned teacup spread its dark stain across the white tablecloth like an accusation, and Geoffrey Ashworth stood frozen beside it, his carefully constructed mask finally slipping beyond repair. Miss Marple observed his transformation with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had watched human nature reveal itself in countless drawing rooms over the decades. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths and the weight of approaching justice. "The tragedy of it all," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had unravelled so many deceptions, "is that Rose never intended to confess to any wrongdoing of her own. Her confession was about witnessing yours, Mr. Ashworth. She was trying to tell Lady Ashworth what she had observed during her Tuesday afternoon duties." Geoffrey's laugh was brittle, desperate. "You're building castles from gossip and servants' tales. Even if there were irregularities in correspondence, that hardly constitutes—" "Murder?" Miss Marple's grey eyes held his steadily. "Oh, but it does, when the stakes are high enough, and the observer too honest for her own good. She reached into her knitting bag and withdrew Rose's small notebook, its brown paper wrapping now seeming to pulse with significance. Rose was extraordinarily methodical, you see. Every Tuesday at 3 o'clock she collected the silver bells from throughout the manor for polishing, her quiet time when the house was at its most peaceful. During these sessions, she began to notice discrepancies in the correspondence. Opening the notebook with careful fingers, Miss Marple read in Rose's precise handwriting, "Tuesday last, saw Mr. G. Take letter from hall table. Red wax seal, return different envelope later. No seal." She looked up at Geoffrey, whose face had gone ashen. "She documented your forgery operation with painful precision, Mr. Ashworth. You were intercepting correspondence from Harcourt and Blythe, creating false documents to accelerate the release of your inheritance funds." Lady Ashworth's hand flew to her throat. "The codicil provisions for the staff. You prevented them from reaching the solicitors. Worse than that," Miss Marple continued, "when Rose's observations threatened to expose your scheme, you discovered her family connection to Mrs. Pemberton's sister in Bayswater. Instead of stopping your illegal activities, you chose to exploit Rose's loyalty to her family. You convinced her that she was complicit in your deceptions, forced her to send money to her aunt as supposed hush money for her silence." Geoffrey's composure cracked further. "She was paid well for her discretion." "She was terrorized into compliance," Miss Marple corrected firmly. "Rose wasn't blackmailing you, Mr. Ashworth. You were blackmailing her, using her honest nature and family obligations against her. But Rose's conscience finally overcame her fear. At the garden party, she resolved to tell Lady Ashworth the truth about what she had witnessed." The reconstruction continued with inexorable logic. "You saw her approach Lady Ashworth with obvious distress, and you knew she was about to expose your entire operation. You had already stolen the digitalis from the library cabinet. Doctor, Pembroke's discreet medical arrangement for Lady Ashworth's heart palpitations provided both means and opportunity." Dr. Pembroke's voice was barely a whisper. "The missing bottle. You used Lady Ashworth's own medicine." "Rose's Tuesday routine made her vulnerable," Miss Marple explained. "You knew she would be alone in the morning room during her bell polishing time, when the house was quiet and interruptions unlikely. You offered her tea, a kindness from someone she had trusted, and administered the poison. The digitalis acted slowly enough for you to search for her hidden documentation." She lifted the silver bell, its engraved L catching the afternoon light. "This told the story, you see. Moved from library to morning room, used as a lever to access Rose's hiding place behind the skirting board. Only someone who knew her exact routine would be confident that no one would ring for service at that precise moment." Geoffrey's hands trembled as he reached for another cigarette. "She wouldn't listen to reason. I tried to explain that discretion would benefit everyone, that no one need be harmed." "But Rose believed in truth over convenience," Mrs. Pemberton interrupted, her voice thick with grief and anger. "She died trying to protect others from your deception." Miss Marple nodded sadly. "And when Inspector Craddock's investigation threatened to uncover your forgery operation, you resorted to arson. This morning's fire was meant to destroy the evidence of your correspondence tampering, but desperation made you careless. The selective destruction, the traces of red sealing wax, the hastily discarded paraffin tin, all pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of what needed to be eliminated." Geoffrey slumped back into his chair, the fight finally leaving him. The creditors were closing in. "I needed those funds immediately, not years from now when the trust matured. It was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, just until an honest girl's conscience made your crimes impossible to sustain," Miss Marple finished quietly. The sound of Inspector Craddock's motorcar in the drive provided the final punctuation to the afternoon's revelations. As Geoffrey was led away, still protesting his circumstances rather than accepting his guilt, Miss Marple reflected on the profound tragedy of Rose Hargreaves, a young woman whose greatest fault was her inability to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. The parlour maid's confession had finally been heard, not as an admission of guilt, but as a testament to the courage required to speak truth to power, even at the ultimate cost. The drawing-room fell into profound silence as Inspector Craddock's motor car disappeared down the tree-lined drive, carrying Geoffrey Ashworth away from the scene of his calculated deceptions. The manor itself seemed to exhale slowly, like a great creature finally released from pain. The overturned teacup remained on the table, its dark stains spreading across the white linen, a permanent reminder of how quickly carefully constructed facades could crumble when confronted with truth. Lady Ashworth sat motionless in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as the full magnitude of her nephew's betrayal settled over her. The financial implications alone were staggering, years of legal arrangements compromised, staff provisions deliberately delayed, and her own medical arrangements weaponized against an innocent girl. More devastating still was the realization that Geoffrey had exploited every intimate detail of her household's routines, turning the very rhythms of domestic life into instruments of murder. "The correspondence from Harcourt and Blythe," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I wondered why their responses seemed so formal, so different from their usual manner. Geoffrey was intercepting them, creating false replies to delay any official action while he accessed funds from the trust. Miss Marple nodded gravely. He needed time to complete his deceptions while maintaining the appearance that everything was proceeding normally. Rose's observations threatened to expose the entire scheme before he could secure what he believed he needed. Mrs. Pemberton, who had remained silent throughout Geoffrey's arrest, finally spoke through her tears. "She was trying to protect all of us, wasn't she?" Rose knew that if the truth came out suddenly, it might hurt Lady Ashworth and cost Tom and me our positions. She was looking for a way to expose Geoffrey's crimes without destroying everyone else. The tragic irony was profound. Rose's very conscientiousness and loyalty had made her vulnerable to Geoffrey's manipulation. Her attempts to handle the situation delicately, to find a solution that would minimize harm to innocent parties, had given her killer time to plan her murder with methodical precision. Dr. Pembroke cleared his throat nervously. "The digitalis arrangement? I should have maintained stricter protocols. If I had secured the medication properly, Rose might still be alive." "You couldn't have anticipated such calculated evil," Lady Ashworth replied, though her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had learned to expect the worst from human nature. "Geoffrey observed my episodes, saw you treat them, and used that knowledge as deliberately as he used everything else in this house." Inspector Craddock returned that evening to complete the investigation's formalities. The fire had revealed additional evidence of Geoffrey's extensive forgery operation, charred fragments of official letterhead, partially melted sealing wax, and most damning, a cache of blank legal forms somehow acquired from the solicitor's offices. The scope of his deceptions far exceeded anyone's initial suspicions. "The London creditors have been quite forthcoming once we explained the circumstances," Craddock reported. "Your nephew's debts were even more substantial than he admitted." The pressure to access his inheritance immediately was overwhelming, though that hardly excuses murder. Tom Fletcher learned that all suspicion had been lifted from him, his relief profound, though tempered by grief for Rose. Lady Ashworth, in one of her first acts following Geoffrey's arrest, confirmed that his position was secure, and that the staff provisions Rose had died trying to protect would be implemented immediately. The village of Upper Netherby absorbed the shocking revelations with characteristic mixture of fascination and moral satisfaction. Mrs. Hartwell, who had been vocal in her suspicions of Tom Fletcher, found herself uncomfortably revising her theories entirely. The post office became a centre of animated discussion as villagers reconstructed events with hindsight's clarity, finding significance in details they had previously overlooked. Yet there was also genuine justice in the resolution. Rose's hidden notebook, with its careful documentation of Geoffrey's crimes, had ultimately provided the evidence needed to expose his deceptions. Her death, tragic as it was, had not been in vain. It had revealed a corruption that might otherwise have continued indefinitely, potentially destroying not only Lady Ashworth's financial security, but the livelihoods of innocent staff members. As evening settled over the manor, Lady Ashworth made a decision that surprised even Miss Marple. She moved the portrait of Evelyn, her daughter, not Sir Lionel's ward, to a place of honour above the drawing-room mantel. "I told the truth about Evelyn today," she said quietly. "It frightened me, but it seemed time. I thought that keeping the secret held things together. It did not. secrets don't prevent scandals, they only prolong sorrows. Miss Marple nodded approvingly. Truth has a way of wanting air, Lady Ashworth. It can be very like a rosebush. Prune it too severely and it sulks. Leave it wild and it scratches you to ribbons. Managed with sense, it flowers. The household began its slow return to normal routines, though everyone understood that normalcy itself had been forever changed. The morning room would require redecorating before Lady Ashworth could bear to use it again. The estate office needed complete restoration following the fire. Most significantly, the trust that had bound their small community together had been tested by the revelation that one of their own had been capable of such calculated evil. Miss Marple sat by the window as darkness fell, reflecting on the particular tragedy of Rose Hargreaves. The young woman had possessed all the qualities society claimed to value: honesty, loyalty, conscientiousness, and moral courage. Yet these very virtues had made her vulnerable to exploitation by someone who valued only wealth and social position. The parlour maid's confession had finally been heard, and through patient unravelling of the truth, Rose Hargreaves had achieved in death what she had been prevented from accomplishing in life: the exposure of Geoffrey Ashworth's crimes and the protection of those she had sought to serve faithfully. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, could be slow in coming, but it did arrive, often in the most unexpected ways. The machinery of justice moved with deliberate precision through the weeks following Geoffrey Ashworth's arrest, each revelation adding weight to the charges that would ultimately see him sentenced to life imprisonment. Inspector Craddock returned twice more to the manor, his earlier confidence replaced by the measured humility of a man who had learned to value observation over assumption. The scope of Geoffrey's deceptions proved even more extensive than Miss Marple's careful deductions had suggested. A systematic fraud spanning 8 months, involving forged documents, false seals, and correspondence so skillfully crafted that even experienced solicitors had been deceived. Lady Ashworth faced the financial reckoning with characteristic determination, working closely with Harcourt and Blythe to untangle the web of false transactions and diverted funds. The codicil provisions that Rose had died trying to protect were immediately reinstated and expanded. Mrs. Pemberton would receive not only her promised pension, but the cottage on the estate she had long hoped for. Tom Fletcher's position was secured with formal recognition as head gardener and a substantial increase in wages. Most poignantly, a trust was established for Rose's aunt in Bayswater, ensuring that the money orders Rose had been forced to send under Geoffrey's threats would continue as genuine assistance. The household itself underwent subtle but significant changes. The rigid hierarchy that had made Rose vulnerable to manipulation was quietly modified, with staff encouraged to report irregularities directly to Lady Ashworth. The Tuesday afternoon routines that had provided Geoffrey with his deadly opportunity were adjusted to ensure no one worked entirely alone during vulnerable periods. The estate office was completely reconstructed with proper security measures, a fireproof safe, new locks and protocols requiring 2 signatures for accessing important documents. Tom Fletcher bore his vindication with quiet dignity, though Miss Marple noticed how he avoided the morning room entirely, as if Rose's presence still lingered there too powerfully for comfort. His gesture of planting a cutting from the Queen of Sweden rose beneath the kitchen window, carefully labelled Rose H., spoke more eloquently than words of his genuine grief and respect for the murdered girl. Dr. Pembroke accepted responsibility for his role in making the poison accessible, voluntarily reporting his informal medical arrangement to the medical board and accepting their censure. His reputation, built over decades of faithful service, survived the scandal, though he privately implemented stricter protocols for all medications, understanding that convenience must never override proper medical procedures. The village of Upper Netherby absorbed the shocking revelations with characteristic mixture of fascination and moral reflection. Mrs. Hartwell, chastened by her hasty judgment of Tom Fletcher, became an unlikely advocate for careful consideration of evidence before reaching conclusions. The post office installed a small memorial plaque honouring Rose's courage in speaking truth to power, a reminder that such bravery should be protected rather than exploited. Lady Ashworth's most significant change was personal rather than practical. Having revealed the truth about Evelyn's parentage during the investigation, she moved her daughter's portrait to a place of honour above the drawing-room mantel. The burden of that long-kept secret once lifted seemed to restore years to her bearing. She spoke now with the openness that truth allows, no longer constrained by the fear of discovery that had shadowed her for decades. The morning room required complete redecoration before Lady Ashworth could bear to use it again, but when the work was finished, she insisted on taking her correspondence there each Tuesday afternoon, not from morbid sentiment, but as a quiet tribute to Rose's conscientious service. The skirting board was properly repaired, though the carpenter left one screw head slightly proud, a small visible reminder that secrets once hidden there would not be concealed again. Inspector Craddock's final visit brought formal closure to the case. "I owe you more than gratitude, Miss Marple," he said, his notebook closed for once. "You saw what we missed, that the smallest disruptions in daily routine often reveal the largest truths." Miss Marple accepted this acknowledgement with characteristic modesty. "It was the apron strings, really, Inspector, and the bells. People reveal themselves in how they maintain their habits as much as in what they say. Rose's careful nature made her both observer and victim, but ultimately it was her honesty that exposed the truth." As autumn approached and Miss Marple prepared to return to St. Mary Mead, she reflected on the profound changes the tragedy had wrought. The parlour maid's confession had achieved everything Rose had hoped for when she first approached Lady Ashworth at the garden party. Corruption exposed, innocence protected, justice served. That it had cost Rose her life remained the tragedy at the heart of the story, but her death had not been meaningless. The village settled into its new rhythms, scarred but stronger, having learned that truth, however painful, was preferable to the comfortable deceptions that had nearly destroyed them all. In the kitchen garden, Tom's rose cutting put forth its first tentative leaves, a living memorial to a young woman whose greatest crime had been an inability to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. 3 months had passed since Geoffrey Ashworth's arrest, and the October afternoon light fell gently across the gardens of Ashworth Manor as Miss Marple settled beneath the ancient oak for her final tea before returning to St. Mary Mead. The same wicker chair, the same silver service, yet everything had changed in ways both subtle and profound. The manor bore the quiet contentment of a household where truth had finally displaced deception, and the very air seemed lighter without the weight of dangerous secrets. Lady Ashworth approached across the lawn, carrying the tea-tray with renewed grace. The perpetual tension that had marked her bearing for decades had eased considerably since revealing the truth about Evelyn's parentage. Her correspondence with Harcourt and Blythe now proceeded with complete transparency, and the codicil provisions that Rose had died trying to protect had been fully implemented. "The house feels different," Lady Ashworth observed, settling into her chair. "As if we can all breathe properly again." Miss Marple accepted her cup with quiet satisfaction. "Truth has a way of clearing the air, even when it brings pain. How is Mrs. Pemberton settling into the cottage arrangements?" "Wonderfully well. She deserves every comfort after 30 years of faithful service." Lady Ashworth's voice carried genuine warmth. "I realise now how my own secrets created an atmosphere where Geoffrey's deceptions could flourish. When everyone must tread carefully around hidden truths, genuine evil finds it easier to hide." In the distance, Tom Fletcher tended the rose beds with particular care. The cutting he had planted in Rose's memory beneath the kitchen window had taken root with remarkable vigour, already showing promise of abundant blooms come spring. His reputation, fully restored, had brought him recognition as head gardener and the respect he had always deserved. Dr. Pembroke's motor car appeared in the drive for his weekly consultation with Lady Ashworth, largely ceremonial now, since her heart palpitations had ceased once the stress of maintaining dangerous secrets was removed. His medical practice had become more rigorous following the tragedy, but his essential kindness remained unchanged. "I've been thinking about Rose," Lady Ashworth said softly, "how she tried so desperately to find a way to expose Geoffrey's crimes without destroying innocent people in the process. Her final attempt to tell me the truth at the garden party—" "She was protecting everyone she could," Miss Marple replied. "Rose understood that sudden revelations might cost you and the staff dearly. She was looking for a gentle way to bring justice without causing unnecessary harm. The village of Upper Netherby had absorbed the scandal with characteristic resilience. The initial shock had given way to sober reflection, and Rose's courage had become part of the cautionary tales passed between neighbours. A small memorial plaque at the post office honoured her memory with simple dignity. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Tom Fletcher approached with a modest bouquet from the established rose beds, not the memorial cutting, but blooms from plants that had weathered many seasons. His gesture was wordless, but profound. "She'd have liked knowing the truth came out proper," he said simply. "Rose always said things should be done right, even when it was harder." Miss Marple accepted the roses with genuine gratitude. The parlour maid's confession had finally been heard, not as Rose had intended to deliver it, but through the patient unravelling of truth that had exposed Geoffrey's systematic fraud and restored honour to those who deserved it. Geoffrey himself awaited trial in London, his elaborate forgery operation fully exposed. The scope of his deceptions had proven even more extensive than initially suspected. Months of intercepted correspondence, false seals, and manipulated legal documents. His desperate need for immediate access to his inheritance had driven him to exploit every intimate detail of the household's routines, ultimately turning Rose's honesty and loyalty against her. As Miss Marple prepared to depart, she reflected on the profound lesson Rose Hargreaves had taught them all. The young woman's greatest crime had been her inability to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing, and that virtue had ultimately cost her life. Yet her death had not been meaningless. It had protected others from the very deceptions she had tried to expose. Human nature remains remarkably consistent, Miss Marple mused, settling into the waiting motor car with her roses carefully arranged beside her. The greed, the desperation, the willingness to exploit trust, these appear whether in bustling cities or peaceful villages. But so too do the virtues. Rose possessed loyalty, courage, and an honest desire to do right. In the end, it was her very goodness that brought the darkness into light. The car pulled away from Ashworth Manor, leaving the grand facade behind as they wound through the familiar English countryside. Miss Marple gazed out at the gentle hills and hedgerows, carrying with her not only Tom's roses, but the satisfaction of justice properly served. The parlour maid's last confession had been heard at last, whispered not in life, but through the careful observation of those small details that reveal the deepest truths about human nature. As always, Miss Marple reflected, evil might disguise itself in familiar forms, but truth, however long delayed, would eventually bloom like roses in their proper season.